Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. You know, if we were to look upon our modern, desolate landscape made barren and bleak by neoliberal policies, junk economics, and never-ending financial fraud, Shakespeare might write these words for his leading bankster tyrant who is deformed by fraud. Now is the winter of our discontent, made glorious summer by these new market highs, and all the clouds that lured upon our property market in the deep bosom of QE and ZERP buried in a car park.
Yes, and of course, once it all comes tumbling down, they'll be shouting, my kingdom for a bar of gold.
My kingdom for some Bitcoin. If Shakespeare were alive today, he'd be writing about Bitcoin. I'm absolutely convinced of it.
Well, you know, I thought of this when I was looking at the Baltimore riots, which have been ongoing. And this tweet from me, notice
You're quoting from your own tweet.
Yeah.
By the way, those Baltimore riots have spread. They're now all over America. But please continue quoting your tweet.
Notice the bleakness of the urban Baltimore landscape, overpriced credit, and overpriced junk food. So I noticed that all of the shops they were tearing down were like 7-Eleven or the check cashing places. And I noticed some people, of course, who always end up at the end backing the banksters, backing the tyrants, backing the Richard III's, are the ones that say, oh, look, why are these protesters burning down a bank? You know, not this check cashing place. And I looked it up. It's Ace Cash Express. Now, here's a headline from only a few months ago. Ace Cash Express to pay $10 million to settle debt collection probe. Irving-based Ace Cash Express, one of the nation's largest payday lenders, has agreed to refund borrowers $5 million and pay the U.S. government another $5 million for using illegal collection tactics such as threatening criminal action against customers who fell behind on payments and informing their employers of debt. And they also bullied them into taking out more and more loans. And in fact, employees were instructed to do this with a graph, a chart of how to get their consumers, the people taking out these loans, to get into a cycle of debt.
Yeah, well, you know, this is where the inflation is. In other words, when Paul Krugman of the New York Times claims that we haven't seen any inflation, there's been no downside to the policies of quantitative easing and 0% interest rates, he doesn't include the ghettos. He doesn't include Baltimore. He doesn't include Ferguson. He doesn't include the black population of America. He doesn't include the Hispanic population of America. He doesn't include the prison population of America. Because according to Paul Krugman in the New York Times, these are non-entities. These are non-people.
Well, and plus the mainstream media just doesn't cover it, so you don't know.
I know, but economically speaking, if you go into these ghettos, as you point out, the cost of stuff is skyrocketing because of inflation brought on by a complete lack of competition caused by these policies that have given the rise to the oligarchy and the kleptocracy. But he doesn't see them, and he doesn't care about them because he's a racist. Let's be honest about it. Krugman is using economics to put forward a policy of racism in America hidden under the cloak of liberal economics, which is nonsense. He's just a racist.
So Richard Cordray, who is the director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which was created after the financial crisis, he negotiated the settlement with Ace Express, and he said this culture of coercion drained millions of dollars from cash-strapped consumers who had few options to fight back. Few options to fight back. Now, this goes in the ghetto, this goes in the suburbs, this goes in the rural areas. Anybody who's not inside the moat of the elite of the 0% interest rates are basically left with no options to fight back, because not only are there obscure small print, but now, you know, we're getting further and further away where there's a parallel justice system being negotiated in these TPP and TTIP sort of deals where it's hard, you can't even get to that magical justice system for them outside the ghetto of everybody else. Everybody's in the ghetto. Everybody. 309 million Americans are in the ghetto. There's a 1 or 2 million who aren't.
Right, and you know, once again, you see the use of economics, finance, and market manipulation to instill a new legalized lynching, legalized murder of minorities, and racism in America. It's not for nothing that at the same time that the Baltimore kicked off, you had Apple Computer introduce another record quarter. Well, those jobs that could have been in Baltimore are in China. They've got $100 billion, almost $200 billion parked offshore to avoid taxes. So you have Tim Cook, he's the CEO of Apple. He's also involved in institutionalized racism by disenfranchising the entire black population of America.
That's alleged. I don't know, but I think.
What do you mean alleged?
I think
What's
it's
alleged?
like part
that they're
of,
offshore?
I think
that
it's
the money's
all of
offshore?
America.
That's not alleged. That's a documented fact.
Apple, in their earnings report, they earned more from Chinese consumers than they did from American consumers. So Americans are themselves all in a ghetto. Well,
due to currency manipulation.
Yeah.
Now that the fact that they're letting the Chinese currency appreciate, you've got some purchasing power in China, finally, but that's after this mercantilist policy of vendor financing from China with the cooperation of the central banks around the world that have disenfranchised a big part of the American population. That's institutionalized racism. It's lynching by proxy.
Another thing about neoliberal economic policies is these taxpayer-subsidized sort of huge arenas for sports events, whether it's a baseball stadium or a hockey stadium or a football stadium, and Olympics. So you see it from Brazil to Greece, which is still paying off the debt of their Olympics decades ago, to, Baltimore, the Baltimore Orioles, Camden Yards. Their stadium was built by neoliberal policies. The taxpayer funded it all, and for these huge corporations. Well, I want to look at this photo of the Orioles field, completely empty. And here's actually a player, Caleb Joseph, coming onto the field, shaking imaginary hands of imaginary fans who are there. In order to protect the fans, they've decided to play their games for the rest of the season without any fans in the actual stadium.
You don't need fans. You don't need fans because professional sports, like the the Glazer brothers, took over Manchester United here in the UK and loaded it up with £1 billion worth of debt and then extracted £1 billion worth of payoff for themselves. They don't need the fans. They use financial engineering in the exact same way that Apple Computer uses financial engineering, or that program in the New York Times advocates financial engineering. You don't need the fans to go to the ballpark to pay a ticket for the Baltimore baseball team to make oodles and oodles of money by leveraging the potential cash flow that they might have at some distant future, according to some theory cooked up by Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan, to collateralize and give themselves huge bonuses. They don't need the fans. They don't need taxpayers. Taxpayers will never pay off the debt in America. The debt in America will never be paid off by the taxpayers. That's why they don't care if Americans have jobs. They don't need their taxes. So they can just, it's economic genocide, which is inculcated into the elite who are rolling this out across the country as a pogrom. This is an annihilation of a population designed to make the elites even more cash.
And so here's another headline from Baltimore: the economic devastation fueling the anger in Baltimore. And there's loads of information about the economic situation in Baltimore, which is 2/3 black, by the way. A third of Maryland itself is black, but everybody in Maryland, unlike many other cities, is like they force it into a
Blacks
ghetto.
are the new Indians in Baltimore. They're going to put them on a reservation, and they're going to try to kill them all.
So it's ground zero for the foreclosure crisis and the mortgage fraud. Remember, the foreclosure crisis has been the biggest disenfranchisement of black Americans in the entire history of the U.S. That includes during slavery. So in 2012, a former loan officer with Wells Fargo testified that she and other officers targeted majority black communities in Baltimore and nearby areas, forging relationships with churches and community groups. They pushed homeowners with perfect credit into loans that had higher interest rates than they should have been paying, and also gave mortgages to people with low incomes who couldn't afford them without any income paperwork or down payments. Bank employees called their clients, quote, mud people, and called the subprime mortgages ghetto loans.
Right, these are the foreclosure going on in Baltimore because mortgages became the new crack in Baltimore, pushed by banksters who are the drug barons, pushing this fake mortgage product. And who's one of the biggest beneficiaries, of course, is Warren Buffett.
Wells Fargo.
Well, Berkshire Hathaway, and he owns a big piece of Wells Fargo, of course. So by institutional a connection, you can say that Warren Buffett is also a racist, along with Tim Cook and along with Paul Krugman.
And so they also, 33% of the properties in Baltimore are abandoned. They're empty. And more than half of Baltimore properties subject to foreclosure on Wells Fargo loans between 2005 and 2008 are vacant. 71% of them are in predominantly black neighborhoods. So you have these abandoned homes. You have 7-Elevens and payday loan outfits charging huge quantities of money. The abandoned homes were abandoned because basically they were given payday loans for their properties, or they had the equity lines of credit, which were then a way to foreclose upon their home and
The
take their
policy
wealth.
is extermination. Instead of a Star of David armband for the people to wear, they're wearing Nike and they're wearing Puma, to identify them as to be shuffled into the ghetto and then exterminated. That's the policy: is extermination, elimination, eradication of the government in America, of the black population.
So around the rest of the world, we have negative interest rates put world on course for biggest mass default in history. More than £2 trillion worth of Eurozone government bonds trade on a negative interest rate. It's a bubble that is bound to end badly. So everybody's looking at these negative interest rates, and some people are like celebrating and think, wahoo, this is great. We're being paid to loan. I'm going to go buy more property. I'm going to get in more debt. I'm going to love this.
Yeah, go ahead.
And not only has this never happened before in such a scale, but it marks a scarcely believable turnaround on the situation at the height of the Eurozone crisis just a little while back, when some European bond markets traded on yields that reflected the very real possibility of default. Yet far from being a welcome sign of returning economic confidence, this almost surreal state of affairs actually signals the very reverse. How did we get here, and what does it mean for the future? Whichever way you come at it, the answer to this second question is not good at all.
Right, so people are being paid to borrow. Like Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan. The more he borrows, the more he's paid. Now, you show me 5 black men in America that are being paid to borrow, and I will eat my socks on this show. Just show me 5. Of the 10 million white guys that are getting paid to borrow, show me 5 black guys, and I'll eat my socks. All right, we got to go.
I want to see that, so I hope somebody finds it.
Fair enough. Stay tuned for the second half. A whole lot more. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go down under to Australia and speak with Das, the author of Extreme Money. His latest opinion piece is titled, How This Debt-Addicted World Could Go the Way of the Mayans. Das, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Good to be with you, Max.
All right. Now, Stacey and I just got back from our trip in Mexico, and so your piece resonated with me in a way, and it's a brilliant piece. All of your writing is, I think, the best, most interesting, culturally relevant financial writing in the world. I will make that statement, and your book, Extreme Money, is a must-read. But tell us, how could this debt addiction lead us into the way of the Mayans? Speak about this.
Well, I think there's 2 or 3 things at the point that I was trying to make. The first point I was trying to make is the problem is we have huge problems of inequality, which we all know. And as part of that, we have a small elite, which is being essentially paid for by the rest of the population. The second point I wanted to make is that rest also aspires to the lifestyles of the Kardashians. So under those circumstances, they don't have the money in terms of wages to do it. So basically the whole model that we've built up over the last 30 years means that they have to borrow because they don't have the wages to pay for it. So under those circumstances, we've built this unsustainable amount of debt. And I just can't see how you can keep going on and on and on. I'll give you a very simple example of that. Let's take not a Western country, but let's take China. China's got debt to GDP of around 280 to 300% of GDP. Its cost of debt is about 6%. So if you multiply, say, the 300 by 6%, they have to be growing each year or making returns of 18% just to pay the interest. They just can't do that. And more to the point, what happens there is they have to keep borrowing more and more just to pay the interest, and they need to borrow more and more to grow at the rate they need to do. So it's basically become a gigantic Ponzi game. And under those circumstances, I just can't see how it's going to continue. And at the moment, we are living through a period when the central bankers and the authorities are trying to extend the game, if you like, through various mechanisms like quantitative easing, negative interest rates. I mean, if you actually think about negative interest rates for more than about 30 seconds, you got to the situation when people can't afford to pay back debt, so you're actually paying them to borrow, which has to be one of the great oxymorons of all time.
Well, let me jump in here for a second. So to stick with the theme of the Mayans, I'm not an expert in these ancient cultures, but wasn't it a case where, to appease the gods, they started sacrificing people? So, here you have to appease the neoliberal, financialized gods of Wall Street and the City of London. We're sacrificing Baltimore. We're sacrificing people in Ferguson. We're sacrificing the entire black population in America at this point. There's a genocide going on to keep this Ponzi scheme and the Kardashians rolling along. Is that where the connection kind of fits in?
I think you're absolutely correct. I'm not sure that they're actually sacrificing virgins, but I think essentially they're sacrificing most of the population. Because if you actually look at that, that's going on in the form of financial repression. You're getting higher taxes, you're getting lower public spending, you're basically getting negative interest rates, so the people with small amounts of savings trying to save for retirement or their kids' education are just basically being punished. It's just a form of taxation. And you now have a very interesting development, Max. I think you've been following this, which is that certain people are trying to ban cash. So you can't actually have physical money anymore. It'll all be electronic. What most people don't seem to understand is if the money is electronic, you lose the two things which are absolutely vital, which is being anonymous and basically being able to be free of interference. And one of the things underlying that, in my view, which people aren't questioning, is that if all this becomes electronic, what's to stop people confiscating the money or using the money in ways that they choose? I mean, people forget that in Greece, the government is now actually taking people's pensions to actually pay the IMF, which is kind of interesting because there must be laws in Greece which say that you can't just take future pension monies and basically move them in this way. And that's happening to various degrees in other countries in different ways. So we've got those sorts of things going on. So that's why I used that line from the great archaeologist Arthur Demarest to illustrate some of these points.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about a couple of these things. So you mentioned Greece. I mean, Greece is another community, another population, a country that's being sacrificed to appease the money printing gods. It's not because the Greeks are profligate. It's not because the Greeks are in some way morally outside of what we need them to behave like to conform to some kind of societal norms. No, Greeks are being sacrificed at the altar of the European Central Bank. And as such, they're, you know, it's amazing to me, Das, that the people in Greece think that they can have an elimination of austerity and at the same time stay in the euro, when we all know that when the Germans are finished taking every last bit of equity, of property from Greece, they're going to kick them out of the euro anyway. Would you agree with that, Das?
Well, let's split your statement up into a couple of bits, because I think there are different bits in it. The first bit is, I think if you look at what's happening in Greece, we all know the bailouts. 80 to 90% of the bailout funds didn't go to Greece. It actually went to the lenders to Greece to pay back existing indebtedness. So it was the whole idea of a bailout is an oxymoron. The second element of that, which I think is very important to understand, is the fact that within Greece itself, there's this huge contradiction, which you point out, which is they want to have their cake and eat it as well. They want to default but stay in the euro. But that's actually part of the tension within the Greek population. If you're a Greek politician or a wealthy person in Greece, of course you want to stay in the euro. You want your pensions paid in euro. You want your wealth in euros. You don't want it in a drachma, which is going to devalue by a significant amount. But underlying all of that is we all know the problem in Greece is twofold. One is they can't pay back this debt, but even if you wipe out all the debt, they don't actually have enough money in terms of taxation revenues to just run the government.
Yeah, but Das. The ECB can't pay back their debt either. Deutsche Bank can't pay back their debt either. France can't pay back their debt. HSBC is bankrupt. BNP in France is bankrupt. So why say, well, Greece is bankrupt, they can't pay back their debt, we need to institute some kind of reforms? That's bull. That's nonsense. They're just being sacrificed like virgins in the Mayan civilization to appease their god of neoliberal money printing.
Calm down, Max. Calm down. Just take a pill. But let's go through what you're saying. You're absolutely correct. The problem in Greece is not a problem of Greece. It's a problem around the world. And you're quite correct. Italy and France are next. I mean, the interesting thing is what Yanis Varoufakis was saying is that when he went to Italy, people in private said to him, we support you, but in public, we can't, because essentially the Germans will get very angry. And the problem is going to go to Italy, it's going to go to France, and the problem is going to spread through the world. And there's really now no obvious solution. And that actually, I think, is the crucial point. Now we are going to effectively sacrifice ourselves to the gods, and we're doing all sorts of pagan rituals because the ECB knows this is all shamanic dances that they're doing and has the same potency as rain dances. Nothing's going to work. And the most shameful thing about this is that the ECB has become effectively an agent of the European Union, an enforcer, using the ELA, which is the funding for the Greek banks, as a choke chain to try to actually control Greek. And I think this is a shameful thing for intelligent people in a central bank to do. I just think it's unimaginable to me.
Well, it's beyond shameful. It's a repeat of history. Germans totally Greece over once spectacularly in the previous century during World War II. Now, after they steal all their assets again, they've already stole half their gold during the World War II episode. They're going to again, and they're going to kick them out of the euro when it's all said and done anyway. So the Greeks should really see this coming. But, you know, it's a triumph of hope over experience, I guess. Now, you mentioned this ban on cash.
Like second marriages, I understand. I think a triumph of hope over experience is how we describe second marriages. And to some extent, the Greek marriage in the euro is a second marriage. They've tried over and over again. But come back to your one point. What I don't understand about Greece is why they don't really do what is very logical, which is to default and leave the euro and basically leave Germany, France, and everybody hanging.
Because of propaganda. It's the same reason they got into trouble during World War II. They were victims of propaganda invented by the propaganda ministers in Germany, and they totally Greece and a lot of other people, and they're doing it again. But I want to talk about your ban on cash for a second, because you said that money, if it becomes electronic, it loses its anonymity, and that money itself is a form of free speech. Now, that's a very interesting thing that you're saying, because in American politics, they've decided that anybody can give any amount of money they want to any political campaign under the protection of free speech. At the same time, they're eliminating the free speech aspect of cash in people's pockets by making it all electronic. That seems to me to be remarkably duplicitous. Your thoughts, Das?
I think you're absolutely correct. There's a huge duplicity going on. But to my mind, money, particularly fiat money, is actually an agency of control. It's one societal mechanism for control, because essentially, once you go away from pure subsistence economies where you can feed yourself, you are dependent on this very strange commodity called money. And that's now being manipulated in different ways. And there's several other layers of almost 1984-like controls. For instance, all our information is being digitized. Now, that means somebody who can control electricity, and as we've seen from the NSA reports that Edward Snowden revealed, there's great penetration of information networks around the world. So what we now have is, with the failure to actually resuscitate the economy, and the fact that if you think of the economy as bread and circuses, and that we can't provide bread, more forms of social coercion actually get manifested. And I think we're seeing that. And that goes back to my analogy of the Mayans. It's almost like the last gasp of a particular civilization when these sorts of symptoms appear.
Right. Now, if you're up for it, I'd like to keep you on to do another segment with you. But before we say goodbye, let me just remind folks I'm speaking with Das. Well, I can't pronounce your last name very well, so I never say it. Well, how do you pronounce your last name?
Actually, it's my first name. It's Chotujit. Das is my surname.
It's like the Madonna of finance. Anyway, you can stay on for a second segment, I hope. Is that okay?
That's fine.
All right, fantastic. Well, that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Das, author of Extreme Money. If you'd like to get in touch, tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.